Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're stepping away from our usual pace. We're going to delve into one of the most harrowing and honestly heavily debated events in modern South Asian history. We're taking a very deliberate, measured look at a tragedy that completely shook a nation to its core.
In 36 hours, the entire command structure of a national paramilitary force was wiped out by its own soldiers. Now, this explainer reconstructs the 2009 Bangladesh Rifles mutiny at Pilkhana in Dhaka. And we're going to be doing this using only documented facts, verified reports, and official inquiries. Because, as you'll see, while the timeline of the massacre is crystal clear, the full motive behind it, well, that remains fiercely disputed to this very day.
To really grasp the scale of this, you have to look at the map of Bangladesh. The country has these massive, porous borders, and the Bangladesh Rifles, or BDR, well, they were the frontline guards of those borders. We're talking about a massive paramilitary force stationed all over the nation. But the true heart of this force, its absolute central nervous system, was located right here in the capital city of Dhaka, at this sprawling headquarters known as Pilkhana. And this is exactly where our timeline begins. But, the tension leading up to the crisis didn't just happen in a vacuum. It actually occurred during a time of supposed unity, which honestly makes the rapid deterioration of order all the more jarring to look back on.
It began during a celebration, one day after the Prime Minister herself had opened it. So it was February 25th, 2009, the second day of what they called BDR Week. It was this highly anticipated annual event. Picture this. Inside the massive Darbar Hall at Pilkhana, thousands of Jawans, these are the rank-and-file soldiers, were gathered for an assembly. Up at the podium was the Director General of the force, Major General Shakil Ahmed. But as he spoke, all these simmering resentments just boiled over. The Jawans began openly protesting against their superiors, specifically the senior officers who were appointed from the regular Bangladesh army rather than rising up through the BDR ranks.
Let's just trace the timeline of these dark hours for a second. We have the inauguration on the evening of February 24th, leading right into that Darbar assembly the next morning. Then, at approximately 9:30 a.m. on February 25th, the situation shattered completely. What followed were these chaotic afternoon negotiations, stretching through a truly terrifying night, and finally ending in a surrender at 8 p.m. on February 26th. But it's what happened immediately after 9:30 a.m. that shocked the world. Within minutes, protests turned into gunfire. The mutineers didn't just voice their grievances, they actually executed a highly coordinated takeover. They seized the compound's armory, passed out weapons, and opened fire directly inside Darbar Hall. What followed was a systematic, brutal hunt. Rebel soldiers started tracking down the senior army officers stationed at the base. Early in this horrifying uprising, Director General Shakil Ahmed was murdered along with several members of his own family.
Now, looking at the immense scale of the Pilkhana compound from above, you can really see why this became an absolute nightmare scenario. It's essentially an enclosed, densely packed city within a city. Once the mutineers barricaded those gates, the army officers trapped inside were completely isolated. They were totally cut off from outside rescue, hunted through the sports complex, the battalion headquarters, and even their own living quarters.
The sheer terror of being trapped inside is captured in this chilling text message sent by a captive officer to his family on the outside. It reads, "Darbar Hall is in control of rebel BDR soldiers. Probably we will never meet again." For the families waiting desperately just beyond the Pilkhana walls, these final heartbreaking messages were literally their only connection to the slaughter unfolding inside.
As the true scale of the crisis became apparent to the outside world, the newly elected government found itself facing an impossible, high-stakes dilemma. The lives of the remaining hostages hung in the balance.
By the time it was over, 57 army officers were dead. Over the course of the following day, the mutineers not only killed these officers, who, remember, were on secondment to the BDR, but they also murdered several civilians. They looted weapons, they raided ammunition magazines, and took the surviving officers and their families hostage. And to conceal their crimes, they actually threw bodies down sewers and buried victims in hastily dug mass graves right there within the compound.
57. It's just a stark, heavy number. It represents virtually the entire command echelon of the border force, wiped out in a single, sustained act of violence. To put that into perspective, it is one of the most severe decapitations of a military command structure in modern history.
The government chose negotiation over storming the compound. Faced with heavily armed mutineers holding dozens of hostages in a very densely populated urban area, the Prime Minister and her cabinet pursued a diplomatic end to the siege.
They literally sent ministers to the gates carrying a white flag. They offered a general amnesty for those who hadn't committed murders, provided they surrendered their weapons immediately. As you can imagine, this decision created massive friction. On one side, the regular army was absolutely furious. They were positioning tanks and demanding an immediate, overwhelming military assault to avenge their slaughtered brethren. But on the other side, the Prime Minister insisted on a negotiated settlement. She feared an armed raid would trigger a catastrophic bloodbath and massive civilian casualties. Ultimately, the political route prevailed, and that led to the mutineers finally surrendering on the evening of February 26th.
But the surrender of weapons did not bring a close to the darkness. In fact, as the bodies were unearthed and the initial shock started to wear off, the state's response initiated an entirely new and deeply disturbing phase of this story.
What followed the mutiny became its own controversy. Because once the compound was secured, the government launched an unprecedented dragnet. That promise of amnesty seemed to just evaporate as security forces began systematically rounding up BDR personnel all across the country.
Over 6,000 BDR members were detained in the weeks and months that followed. Suspects across all ranks were pulled directly from their barracks by security forces, most notably the Rapid Action Battalion, or RAB. The sheer volume of these mass arrests completely overwhelmed the justice system, and it set the stage for some truly horrific abuses behind closed doors.
47. That is the staggering, verified minimum number of detainees who subsequently died while in custody. Human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch, documented reports of severe, systematic torture during interrogations. Detainees reported being subjected to brutal beatings, intense sleep deprivation, and even electrocution as investigators tried to extract confessions and identify the masterminds of the massacre.
And the judicial process that followed was equally scrutinized. In 2013, a mass trial convicted hundreds of BDR personnel, handing out massive numbers of death sentences and life imprisonments. But international rights groups like Amnesty International harshly criticized the proceedings. They described the mass verdicts as a perversion of justice, calling it, and I quote, designed to satisfy a desire for cruel revenge. By trying hundreds of men in a single courtroom, they argued, it was simply impossible to ensure individual due process. It transformed the trial into an act of collective punishment.
So, now we arrive at perhaps the most complex piece of this entire puzzle. Even after the bloodshed, the investigations, and the mass trials, a shadow still hangs over the narrative, because the core question remains unanswered. To this day, nobody agrees on why it actually happened. I mean, how did a dispute over internal force conditions suddenly ignite into a highly coordinated massacre of military elites? Well, the explanations are deeply divided. There are two starkly competing narratives that divide the nation today. The official investigations at the time pointed to long-standing, unresolved workplace grievances. The BDR soldiers were angry about vast disparities in pay compared to the regular army, they were furious over being excluded from lucrative UN peacekeeping missions, and they alleged intense corruption by army officers regarding Operation Dalbot, which was a subsidized food program. However, over the last 16 years, some really explosive claims have surfaced, suggesting an entirely different reality. Recent national inquiry commissions and public suspicions point to a high-level, orchestrated political conspiracy. These theories suggest the mutiny was actually engineered by political elites and external forces specifically to decapitate the army's leadership and consolidate power. Now, it is absolutely crucial to note that this explainer does not take a side on these unproven claims. We are simply presenting the deep schism in how this history is understood by the public today. Could a tragedy of this unimaginable scale truly be the result of a mere dispute over pay? Or is a much darker conspiracy still hidden in the shadows? The full truth of Pilkhana may never be settled, but the 60 lives it took were real, and they deserve to be remembered accurately. Thank you for watching Dark Chronicles. Real stories, verified sources. Follow for more.